Hello.
Greetings and salutations.
I think I've fairly well monopolized the agenda today. So if other folks have stuff they want to talk about, feel free to put things in above me. I don't actually intend to be the only person to talk today, despite what the agenda said.
Yeah, I know I wanted to talk refers API, which I think is on yours anyway. So I think it all, all goes hand in hand. I don't know if John's showing up today too. We had some similar stuff to discuss. What is
some of this, I talked to him yesterday and some of this came out of that. So if he's not here, I volunteer to be the John stand-in. And I'll try not to mock him too much.
What I miss with Josh is I haven't been here in a few weeks. Is this a weekly thing?
So going through some sort of transformation. I'll fill you in.
When you drop a hot dog on the ground and you pick it up and it's covered in hair, don't eat that hot dog.
We know from experience, so.
So Jason, do you rinse it, put it back on the grill?
Yeah. I think if it's on a grill, like the heat'll take care of anything. Get the hair off, put it on the grill, you're fine.
The advantage of having chickens, you don't have to toss anything. Just give it to the chicken.
There you go. And then you can put the chickens on the grill.
Looks like I got a pretty good showing here, so I'd say whenever you're ready, Jason.
Yeah. The first item is probably going to be falling on deaf ears because I don't think there's any image spec maintainers here who have not already given a thumbs up to this PR, but I will go and bug BBATs and anyone else who will listen. We'd like to specify in image spec that WASM is treated differently than the Go recommendation. Happy to talk about this, but otherwise I was just hoping there to be another image spec maintainer to bug, and there isn't, so we can move on.
Do we want to dig into how many maintainers we want to have on that before hitting approve?
Isn't there a policy of more than half or 4?
Usually we just go with, I think, 2 for small things, but this might be confrontational enough that we want to think harder about it. So that's why I'm raising the question, is this above that threshold?
I don't think this is that controversial. However, it would be nice to have a policy that is stated and clear that anyone could understand how many image spec maintainers it takes to merge a thing of any size, of any level of controversiality. I don't know. It's not urgent now that the folks that were violating this not spec were, know that they should do something else. So I'm not in a rush, but in general, it would be nice to have more active image spec maintainers to beat a dead horse.
Just for curiosity, what does the Go runtime return under WASI case.
Go's only support for WASM is specifically to generate JavaScript and WASM to run in a browser. It doesn't have any idea about WASI non-browser WASM cases. And doesn't seem to be on track to have that soon. So the idea is that we would specify that follow the Go guidance on GoArch and Go OS, except if you're doing WASM in a non-browser setting, which we should use WASI WASM instead of JS WASM.
So what do they return inside the JavaScripty browser version?
Like if you call runtime Go OS inside of a JavaScripty WASM thing, it would say JS.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and there's no non-JS, like when they implemented this in Go, WASM was only JavaScripty, was only used in JavaScriptiness. So it made sense at the time, but now WASM has 5 more years of growth and adoption and stuff. And so I think Go is just a little behind on that. But yeah, I'm happy to move on because no one here can help me. I wanted to really briefly talk about OCI artifacts, one of my top 3 favorite topics. Last week or 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, Docker Hub announced that they support OCI artifacts, and I found out yesterday that isn't exactly true. OCI artifacts, as described in the 1.1 RC whatever release, is a new manifest type with media type artifact and an artifact type field and etc. And Docker Hub does not support that.
The qualifying phrase, I think they said, was they're supporting the OCI version 1 artifacts. Okay. I should look it up on their blog. But yeah, I think there is continued sort of room for ambiguity and confusion while we live in the world where artifacts can mean these two things.
Yeah, I had to take another look at the artifact repo after reading that to see if there's any clarity there. But I think maybe in our own artifact repo, it's not super clear exactly what it is still, or how you're supposed to interpret it.
Yeah,
we're going to archive the artifacts repository.
Right, from the OCI summit that we had before KubeCon, I had an action item to ferry out useful stuff from that repo into ImageSpec, and then with it being devoid of useful stuff, archive it and say look over here for this. I'm still planning to do that, but I just wanted to get sort of more people's eyes on this problem. And when you hear OCI artifacts, understand that they probably mean the other thing than what we mean.
Probably, and they were specific in the blog that that what they were doing was modification of the 1.0 spec using or changing the type from image to an artifact type right on the mine, and they didn't really explain that that's not supported in the 1.0 spec right now in main, but we haven't shipped that version yet. A new release that has the restriction for using the artifacts in the 1.0 format, as was done by ORAS and the artifacts repo before we had this work group, right?
Yeah. I think
I'm just saying, Jay, I think we should be, I guess, a little tolerant, if you will, of the prior implementations. And I think that's what Brandon did when he described it. Brandon's got his hands up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say they definitely said, hey, we're supporting the 1.0 version of the spec. And part of the reason was 1.1 hadn't even been released yet. And so they don't want to put a release on something that hadn't been released yet. The bigger concern I had was when they put the filter in there on the subject field, because that blocks the backward compatibility that we had with what was going on with the newer implementation. So
the fix for that's in progress.
Thanks, Dan.
That makes me very happy.
That makes sense. That's good.
Is the distinction here that the V1 artifacts is where you kind of take an artifact and shove it into an image manifest and make it play nice with OCI?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I just encountered that for the first time recently and was quite confused about the naming differences.
Yeah. That's where we need in this new image spec location where they're going to talk about the 1.1 stuff. They probably should make mention of, you know, some legacy uses of the 1.0 spec.
Yeah,
Great.
I have an unsent PR for this that I need to do a little wordsmithing on. But anyway, this is a mostly unactionable topic, except that the action is I need to do some stuff. I just wanted to sort of get more people aware that we are still confusing folks with what artifacts means.
Ping me when you need a review, Jason.
I will.
Yeah, I was working with someone who's using the ORES tool, and like the default push flow from that uses the old form, and you have to use the blobs and manifest subcommands to get the new form. So that was a point of confusion just yesterday, I think, for us.
Yeah, and part of it is like registries don't support the new artifact manifest, so clients don't have a reason to. We're definitely in this weird transitionary phase.
Chicken egg. Yep.
But yeah, all right. Before I monopolize the agenda, does anyone else have anything else they'd like to talk about as far as stuff? Otherwise, we can go into refers changes.
I guess one thing I'd like to, I guess we could just add it to the agenda, was we talked about creating a work group for authentication. Like to get that kicked off.
I still have an open window of some stuff that I need to finish writing before VS Code knocks me out, because I haven't restarted it for too long. So it is on my to-do list.
Okay, so you're gonna post that up. All right.
Yeah.
Volunteer. You have a volunteer if you need some help on that work group. I've got some requirements I need on the IBM side of the fence, and in this case, so I'd like to jump on and help. Anyhow.
All right, if there are no other blockers to me monopolizing, I'm going to go ahead and monopolize. I talked to John a bit yesterday, and there's also this issue 357 in distribution spec about loosening some of the requirements in the refers API to be mays instead of musts, not even shoulds, but all the way back to may. I know this was a topic we talked about months ago for probably months at a time in the reference working group, but I think I am convinced by his argument that we should soften these. Does anyone have a strong reason not to soften them?
Can you give a description of the issue a little bit?
So one of the issues is that if I push a manifest with annotations and a subject, and then I go get the referrers for that subject, the current iteration of the spec at head right now says the referrers API response must include the hoisted annotations from that manifest in the descriptor. So this requires some processing on the registry side to like extract those and put those in the response. And I think it might be, oh, John's here. Well, John might not.
That's not very easy.
Drop.
So you're saying you could have annotations and a subject in what, do you have to do both? It doesn't make sense if the subject's
this is the API response.
The subject referrers response includes the referring manifests annotations hoisted. Not each of the blobs annotations, just the like top level annotations. And I think that is a bit onerous on the registry to be able to do that processing at the kind of scale we're talking about. The alternative, or an alternative to that, is that if you want the annotations of that, your client has to go fetch that manifest and get those annotations. And I liked this as an option, as a possible mitigation to this, that the registry, I think the word is may, the registry may embed that manifest as data in that descriptor. And now you may have access to the annotations and everything in that manifest inlined in that response. for each object, for each manifest referencing the thing.
Makes sense.
Brandon, you have your hand up. I think
yeah, I commented on the issue, so I was just going to raise up those comments just to put them for the overall community here. The two concerns I have: one, if we do the data field, because that's pulling the entire manifest in, that could also pull in data fields within that child manifest, which means you're now growing this thing rapidly because the data field is not as compressed as a base64 encodes something that's larger than what it originally was. And because we say may, we might even be dropping those. So there's that risk. The bigger risk is because once we say may on the annotations, if I pull an image and say query and tell me all the things that point to it, and a registry comes back and says these 50 different manifests have a reference pointing over to that, and it doesn't fill in the rest of the annotations, and I'm looking for the most recent or something that matches a GPG fingerprint or whatever criteria I have to know which manifest I want to pull, I have to pull all 50 of those manifests individually.
Yeah,
from the client side.
To summarize that, I think the issue is that if we say the registry may hoist the annotations and may include data, that if they do neither, then you don't know when you get neither back, you don't know whether you have to go fetch those to all the manifests.
And it's also possible that the original manifest did not have any annotations, but I don't know that until I pull the manifest.
Right. I think we could say registries should do one or the other, or registries should set the data field. We have an option between must and may that we could use. We can argue about which one should be a should, but there's at least, it's worth noting there is a note between may and must.
As soon as it drops from should to, or must to should, if I get back a response that doesn't have that field filled out, I don't know if it is truly a manifest that has no annotations, or if the annotations are there that I'm looking for and I have to pull it. And so because I don't know, that turns this into I have to pull every single manifest regardless. Doesn't matter whether it should, may, or whatever.
Yeah, I think the solution, the registry doesn't want you to do that either, right? Like the registry doesn't want to get slammed with 50 requests
for every
anymore
image.
than you want to make 50 requests. And so it sort of benefits the registry to do one or the other based on its idea of which is easier to do. I don't know how every registry is implemented. I don't know whether one would be easier or harder to implement for any given registry, but it seems worthwhile saying that registries should do one or the other for their own benefit as much as for the client's benefit. It's useful for the registry to do that too.
So from the client side, if we drop this from must to should, how do I differentiate? How do I know when I get that response back that this registry is trying to be helpful to me and it includes something? How do I know which scenario I'm in, whether or not I have to pull it manifest?
Yeah, if the response includes the data field, because it has populated not only the annotations but of the whole manifest in that data field. If it returns annotations, you know that it is giving you annotations. If it is giving you annotations but it's the empty set of annotations, you're right, there's no way for you to know whether that is an empty set of annotations or a populated empty set of annotations.
If it gives me annotations, how do I know that that is a complete set?
I don't think we're dealing with any case where it would partially hoist annotations, right? Like a registry would have to be pretty odd to do that.
I have heard that recommendation a few times though, where registries say we don't want to let users put everything in there. We want to pick the annotations we're interested in, and that's all we're going to put up.
Or the first 4K, yeah. Kind of
I would recommend against that for registries that want to do that, because it's only going to, it might benefit them to return what they think is valid, but it's going to cause confusion on the client, and the client is, Brandon, to your point, going to respond to that confusion by going and making 50 more requests to actually go fetch it, which I don't think the registry wanted, right? Like I'm not going to give you partial data so that you can come and ask me 50 more times for complete data. But yeah, I think I would recommend against registries trying to do smart stuff like that. For my own part, I think returning the whole data field is an elegant option for the registry because you get to short circuit all the requests. You may, like to your point, you may embed data twice, which is a bit gross. We'll base 64 things twice. But if it is a small, like specifically signature data, you can avoid a lot of hops to return the, couple of hundred bytes of data you might care about.
The flip side of that is if I short circuited that for one manifest, I still had to pull back the data field for all the other manifest, for all the other signatures, for all the other things. And so overall, we are looking at a lot of data.
If we say the registry may hoist the data field, that is not registry wide, that is request wide. The registry can now make a decision about whether it says, it's a signature, it's under a K, and so I'll embed it. Or it's a 500 megabyte, SBOM, you're going to have to fetch that yourself. I think it gives a lot of flexibility to the registry to do what it thinks is cheap and worthwhile.
So the people that I want to hear from are being a little quiet, so I'm going to pick on Michael Brown to see if he wants to give the AWS viewpoint of things. Of course, I just name people until they frantically say, shucks, I wasn't ready for the question.
Yeah, I'm catching up. I thought that. So is it now where you're saying annotations may be hosted, but also the data field may be present, or none of so that now we have like 3 or 4 combinations of things that requests could do.
Yeah, I think that's right. The registry may hoist the annotations from that manifest. It may hoist the whole thing into the data field. It may implicitly do neither. But I think that is something registries should not do. I think we should say registries should do one or the other for sanity, for sort of to avoid mistakes like that.
I mean, definitely it should change based on the biggest piece. I wouldn't want like some references in the response to have data and some not to, and some to have annotations and some not to. Like, I think clients should be able to expect if, I don't know, it just seems like it's confusing with all of these mays. It seems like clients are going to have to write a lot of code, and registries are, because of that, probably some bugs. And so some registries will work and some won't. And I don't know, consistency is something I kind of still like having.
I think that's I think that's a useful viewpoint. I think that's right. Like, less complexity, good. I think the least complex thing would be to not hoist either. And the client always knows it has to go and fetch those manifests if it thinks it might care about annotations, or it thinks it might care about the stuff in there. The simplest thing to do is sort of brute force. Now you make a bunch of requests, which we could also change the spec to say that it is not expected to return the annotations. It's not expected to return the data. If you care about annotations, go and fetch it.
Could the registry add annotations there? Like, I'm trying to think. So I'm trying to implement some of the client side here, and it's tricky to figure out, like, what do we want to filter on and sort on the client side. From my perspective, the most relevant are probably going to be timestamps of when something was created or uploaded to the registry. Like, is there cases where the registry might add annotations that say when this was uploaded?
I think that's pretty out of character for a registry. Like, I think it's pretty unusual for a registry, at least using standard OCI APIs, to inject new data. I would be, I think, maybe pleasantly surprised, but at least surprised.
The entire refers API follows that characteristic, though. It's generating a brand new index kind of on the fly, as opposed to like the compatibility mode, which is pre-generating an OCI object and relying on our normal mechanism there.
Yeah,
like immutable.
I would say that because annotations are a field that are open-ended for the client to provide on their manifest, that if you start putting a field in there, there's a very possibility of a collision, potentially intentional, that a client's trying to override that field. So it might make more sense to put any other metadata in another field, because you can always add another piece into a descriptor with a different name, not an annotation, not a descriptor, any of those things, just another field in there.
Are you proposing that we specify that OCI specify another server-side annotations thing for it to put its annotations?
No.
I'm not ready to do that now, but I would say that if there is some usage that happens, it wouldn't hurt for us to standardize what that usage means later on.
I think it'd be fair for the client to set the annotation in the artifact, and then if the server doesn't see it, to add it. But at the same time, that changes the digest. So yeah, maybe not.
Yeah, I would not want to modify the manifest. And I wouldn't want to potentially step on a field that is in the manifest. So I would say if you're making your descriptor, you've got the digest, you've got the media type, you've got the annotations, make a fourth field that we haven't defined yet.
Yeah, what do you think about that, Derek? Just push it, letting the client side on it.
Yeah, I think I would argue I definitely don't want the server to inject dynamic content into my manifest ever. Even if I didn't specify the created time for this, I want that to be heavily cacheable and content addressable, and not.
I think others would argue or take away. So
yeah.
I think
annotations express the user, the client's data, and should not be augmented or cut away. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, changing the manifest is not.
Even not acceptable. Yeah, I don't think anyone was actually arguing to change the manifest, but
I think it's more about this. Data. Yeah, the refers API response itself is this dynamically generated.
Right.
But the annotations that are in that descriptor come from the manifest, and so you have a namespace collision problem where if you start putting a field in there of your own annotation name, it's very possible the manifest can put the same annotation name in there. So I would say to avoid collision, inject any of your other metadata on
here, though. I mean, that's what this group is intended to specify, that behavior and those annotations.
I would lean toward putting a field in there that the client can't override, that you're putting some extra metadata in the descriptor and it's just in a different field other than annotation or digest or media type. Just make your own field.
I think that also says to me that a registry that wants to inject this information can, because you can add whatever fields you want to any type, except for reserved stuff. I don't know if we even had those, but like if Brandon's registry wants to inject more fields that say when this manifest was created and mine doesn't, then we're all welcome to do that. And eventually, if clients pick it up and want to do it, we may all agree to do it and specify it. Some of the difficulty in doing the reference API design work was that none of us have implemented it yet. It's not something we're not specifying a thing we implemented, we're specifying a thing we'd like to all implement. So it's a bit backwards and hard to do.
Well, yeah, that's kind of the point of the working group, is to go through that process. Yeah. And I'm trying to go through some of that process now. The refers API itself is kind of thorny. I feel like from a client implementation side.
I think that's useful feedback, and like please tell us where the thorns are and we'll try to break them off. Like I'm also implementing a client library to do this, and hitting things that kind of suck. And I think we knew, because we were designing it all before anything was built, that we were doing that to unchicken and egg the problem, and now there are enough of us implementing it that we can start to file bugs against it and fix it.
Yep. Yeah, that's one of the things I've kind of want to discuss here. I don't want to go into my stuff first though.
By all means, I think I've talked about everything that I intended to talk about. If you have other stuff, go for it.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the concerns I had is kind of like what you were saying at the beginning, talking about, oh, are we gonna pull down these 50 objects or whatnot? Like, I think from a client perspective, especially from Containerd, we do kind of more of a synchronization approach. So we're trying to figure out how do we approach this refers API that's kind of unbounded, as opposed to images aren't really unbounded in size, at least from number of like objects that we would need to pull. Obviously layers can be unbounded in size, but the number of objects we pull is not unbounded. But now here we're trying to look at this API that's potentially unbounded, and it's unclear like what objects we're actually going to need from that. And I understand the annotations are intended to help with that, but from my perspective, if it's clear that there's a small subset, say, of those 50 objects, I assume we're not talking about 50 different artifact types as a normal use case, but in the 99.9% of the time, there's going to be a single refer that any given operation is going to need. So if you're doing some sort of signature check, likely there's going to be one signature, maybe two. But for the most part, we're dealing with a pretty small set of objects that are needed. And from a registry perspective, yeah, they don't want to serve up all those objects. But the language now makes it sound like the registry has to keep around every object that it's given and has to give them all out, which I don't understand why that's needed, rather than the registry itself being able to filter or being able to easily override without having to explicitly go back through and delete content from the client side.
So there were a few things in there, and I want to make sure that I got them all. One is that perhaps the registry would like to delete things that refer to things without the user's input. Is that something that you're interested in?
Not necessarily deleting, but able to apply some sort of filtering, or maybe be able to apply some sort of like what we have with tagging today, right? You can tag, you overwrite a name, and we might keep around the old manifest, but if you know about it, it might still exist, but at that point it might be kind of eligible for garbage collection. I see the same thing here with like signatures. You may sign something, and then you may go through and want to overwrite that previous signature. But yeah, like from a client perspective, you might be in a case where now you're just serving up multiple signatures to the client. The client now just has to go back through and filter it, rather than having some explicit way to just say, okay, I want to replace this one thing. Maybe like there's no central like identifier to say, hey, I have this artifact and this kind of artifact ID that I'm trying to like overwrite, or I'm trying to use. Like I have one signature that I want. And as it's coded today, it seems like, yeah, you can just add them unbounded, and not a clear way to manage that.
Yeah, I think that's the signing client's responsibility to solve. Like if I'm signing an image or an artifact or whatever, I have to decide at that moment whether I'm appending my signature or replacing all signatures with mine, or replacing, I only want to keep the last 5 signatures. And so if this is the 6th signature, find the oldest one and delete it. That seems like all client.
Which the compatibility mode, I think, actually, going back from the client perspective, I like the compatibility mode more than the refers API, because in the compatibility mode, it's very clear.
Yeah.
Like, okay, here's the signature. Let me overwrite it and then upload it. I know it has its own thorns for consistency, but from the standpoint of like a client perspective, the compatibility mode is actually pretty nice.
Yeah. In order to replace a signature in the refers API world, you have to add your, create a new thing that refers to it, go look up its references or look up its referrers, and then delete any old ones that match that you want to replace. And you either do that before or after, but either way, it's sort of a two-step process. So yeah, I agree that it's a bit more magical on the registry side. Brandon, go ahead.
I'm just going to add to that. If any attempt to do that on the registry server side, I feel like you're going to fail as soon as the next unknown kind of artifact type shows up and you don't know how to process it and how to dedupe it. It's we don't know how users are going to use this tomorrow. We know how they might use it, for the current use cases, but someone's going to come up with a new use case that we haven't planned for. And so it's trying to implement that on the server side feels problematic.
So from the client side, I feel like what we're going to have to do, like usually when we deal with this kind of unbounded response case from a registry, is have some sort of like limits that we have to put in there, which then it comes into the how do we sort. And I think that brings up the previous conversation relevance of it, which is, if the only way we can sort and filter is based on annotations, like having to go fetch a bunch of content just to say we don't need it is not a great case. But yeah, I think John's concerns are valid as well. That's kind of why I suggested, is there some way, like if the registry does have logic for doing some sort of filtering or sorting, that could be represented in the annotations, that, like this is the timestamp that the registry is using to do some sort of sorting of it to give you the most recent.
Yeah, we held back on getting more advanced in the filters. So doesn't mean we can't add it in the future to create more advanced filtering on the server side if we wanted to. But to start with, to keep it simple to get people to implement it, we avoided adding too much of that on day one, just because we were afraid people wouldn't implement it if they had to support too many complex server side capabilities.
Yeah, I'm certainly not thinking of, I know we talked about in terms of like, be able to pass like arbitrary annotations or something like that. That's definitely not what I was thinking of there. For the most part, I think it's more, which is the most recent of a specific artifact type is probably going to be most relevant for those cases.
It might be relevant in some cases, and then you get to next ones where someone says, well, I want the most recent, but it needs to match this filter because I don't care about the other person that signed it. I care if this person signed it, or I don't care the most recent SBOM. I want the most recent SBOM in this format. So there's always some other case in there that we haven't planned on. What we did do, though, was we tried to push a lot to the client side. So that's why I push all the annotations back, at least until I get overridden on that one. And we allow you to filter by the media type, so you can at least knock out a large chunk of it. You end up sharding the data, and so you only pull back media types that you recognize. And then the biggest thing to me is if you look at it, you're not pushing too many annotations. You're talking about 1,000 some odd responses before you hit the 4 meg size limit on an index, and then you have paging in there as another ability and to continue that even more. So I feel like we've got pretty good flexibility to scale this up pretty large before you run into issues, and that's per image. So it's
Sajay has his hand up, so I'll let him go first. But yeah, I think I had another comment about pagination as well.
So we've been considering implementing it with filtering and not, but sorting by the annotation that is called out in the chat right now. So the artifact created time is what we, at least from Azure, said that we were thinking of using as a default way of sorting things, because it's not specified in the specification, but this annotation specifically was called out. The problem is we don't have an actual use case and clients implementing it, so we don't know exactly whether that'll be useful or not. So it's a rough cut. But I think the question that we're talking about is, yes, we want to find out the latest thing that people have pushed or attached to. But the second level of filtering will not work with this, because if it's a signature that comes afterwards, you still want to maybe look at the key, depending on the key and whatnot, right? So there's a little bit of a challenge there. But just to kind of like share with this group, the created time is definitely something that we are interested in kind of pursuing as an implementation also. I don't know whether other operators want to kind of take that path, but that's something that we felt is at least important to look at.
Since that's a client-generated field, is there a concern that a system with a bad timestamp or a bad time on it could potentially
the client is generating, because the client is generating the data, the client can corrupt the data. There's nothing stopping them from pushing a signature up or re-pushing the same blob with new manifest and a new created time. So they can control how the sort order is fully. That's the whole reason why the sort implementation is actually controlled by the client indirectly, because they decide where the item needs to come as well.
Yep.
I was just going to say, in any case, that's not specified by the spec. So that might be an optimization that ACR has, but clients can't depend on it.
Right, correct.
So sort of as a client, you're just sort of going to have to look through everything anyway to see that the thing you want isn't there. Right, like what if my registry is antagonistic and is mostly sorted except the last two things are out of order? There's no way to guard against that in a general way, but I think it's useful to have that optimization. You know, you are free to have your sorting order whatever you want it to be.
And my hope is that we'll see from this community how they want the data and how they kind of like use the data, and that will help at least specification to improve. Right now, like you said, we don't know what we're designing for until we have implementations there.
Yeah, which says to me we should specify as little as usefully possible and wait for people to use it, and then sort of pave the cow paths that people are using it for, rather than try to guess what people use it. And not that you are doing that. I think you are doing a good thing for your use case, but whenever we don't have users and we're designing something, I want to design as little as possible until people start to use it.
I think the vision we had when we were originally writing this was that we would potentially have a whole lot more advanced filtering in there. So you could say sort by this one field, but only on the entries that match this other annotation, and it would all be annotation based. And so that's still possible. It doesn't mean that what we've implemented now is the only thing we've got, but like Jason said, we start with a minimum viable product. We're getting this out the door, seeing how that looks. And then once we start seeing those use cases, then we can decide, does it make sense to add annotation specific filtering from the server side?
Yeah, so I don't know if we've come to any useful conclusions or useful things to try to push on.
I think my concern was more the other way around, of like, instead of managing, you know, more and more refers, but try to define ways that keeps that set of refers small and useful for the client. Because I think in the majority of use cases, there doesn't need to be thousands of refers. That is an edge case that we should maybe support, but like in Containerd, we probably won't even add support for that. Like I don't think we're trying to talk about whether we even want to support pagination at all. Like
yeah, that's also complete. Like that's a good thing to note. It is totally viable for a registry to limit the number of things that can refer to a thing, and for a client to limit how many pages it will fetch, and maybe never fetch the second page. These are all completely valid things for people to limit.
So you said the magic word there of Containerd. I'm curious what you're thinking of from the runtime side when it's using this. What use cases do you see right now where the runtime needs to pull this down? Because I'm frantically thinking about how I'm going to break all your use cases.
Well, yeah, we're trying to figure out whether it makes sense to pull or have an option to repull when you pull an image, when you fetch an image down, whether to fetch the refers as well. The problem is, I think I was just saying, like if there's like a couple of refers, it makes sense. If there's 50 refers, it doesn't make sense. The idea is like we don't so Containerd does more of like a synchronization approach. Like we synchronize content locally and then we make use of it. Like we synchronize the content first and then we'll unpack it. But we have more and more use cases like lazy loading snapshotters where we're not necessarily syncing down everything. We're syncing down metadata and then letting specific plugins go back through and pull them. So that might be the approach we end up taking, where we fetch the refers index possibly on fetch, but then allow individual plugins to make use of like how they want to do that. So, I mean, you could think of like an image validation plugin that runs during poll that wants to access signature data or some sort of refer data and make use of that. And yeah, I guess for us, it's like, where do we make that decision? Like, I think the compatibility mode makes it easy for us because it's very clear what metadata we need to fetch. But the refers API is a little bit tricky because it's not necessarily clear what filters we'd want to apply to that endpoint. And if we just said, always gave a filterless refers, then in theory, we have the full list. But if that list is too large, it's not, yeah.
So by default, the compatibility API and the refers API, if you don't specify anything, are the same. It's an identical response between the two.
Is that specified? I think the things we're talking about hoisting annotations and about potentially ordering differently.
Ordering, maybe not. Yeah. Ordering, we never said what the order means anywhere.
In compatibility mode, do we hoist the annotations?
Yes. When you generate that index, you're hoisting the annotation client side. And it doesn't have to do it for all manifests because it's only adding one new manifest to the list. So it only needs to know its own manifest, annotations, and it assumes the rest of them were already done correctly on the first time. So yeah, that was one key point. The other one I really want to dig into on Containerd, though, my fear, the thing that concerns me, if you pull down a signature, no big deal. They should be small. They should be easy to pull down with the image. You start pulling down SBOMs, those are going to get significantly larger. So if you're pulling the manifest, okay, that's cool. If you start pulling down blobs, I get really worried about performance long-term because I have plans, not plans, I currently implement stuff that attaches very large things to images. And I don't want a 10 meg image to have to pull down a couple hundred megs of other metadata.
You're the edge case though. Not worried about that.
I plan to be the primary use case of everything, but that's just me and my world domination plans.
Pat, sounds like Sanjay's patches.
Oh yeah, we haven't spoken about that. I had a question for the Containerd implementation because this is really awesome, useful data, right? So let's assume that there are multiple different types of artifacts that have been attached. Is your thinking that you will pull down every type, or will you at least filter by some specific media type? That's one thing that would help to kind of like at least ask for only the things that you want, right? Because if you want to pull down everything, and if you have a scan report attached every day, that's going to be a lot. So what is the thinking right now?
Well, and that's kind of what we're figuring out. Like we're just adding the low level part now, which basically gives access from our registry configuration to call the refers API and then try to handle the compatibility mode kind of automatically for you. But I think as Brandon was saying, it's like there's no our APIs are lower level, at least like at the remote end. It's just giving you a reader, and that reader is expected to be OCI index. But like obviously if you pass in an artifact type, which I did add artifact type to the API, I'm not sure that it makes sense because maybe we want other filters as well. But now we're talking about who's applying that filtering, because if you pass the artifact type up to the registry is doing that filtering. But if the registry doesn't support the refers API, then you potentially just get back that like it's ignored. So like from the client perspective, like, do we apply that filtering? Normally in Containerd, it's like our backend APIs from the registry, we don't touch the data that comes back to it. But it seems like in this case, the registry could be touching it, you know, in terms of like the registry could be applying filters to that OCI index. So long way to say, not sure exactly what we want to do there.
It makes sense that you described the interface, which is not, there is no way that the data can be inspected. There was another similar thread where the ORAS project was using just a reader, and there's no way that we actually looked at the manifest, so we couldn't apply the filter on the index for us, a very similar reason. But from the API standpoint, I think recommending users to use the artifact type might at least guarantee some amount of filtering, both from the server side, or if you have a giant index with everything mixed in it, at least you only start looking at the descriptors that you really need to, ignoring the annotation filtering and the data field filtering part.
Yeah, it depends a little bit too what that interface for making use of the refers looks like. Because if it's in Containerd, it's likely to be a plugin interface. So you could have plugins that care about different artifact types,
right?
That want to say, hey, like, by the way, when you're fetching the refers, like, make sure you grab the artifact type that I care about. And then, like, do we have a bunch of plugins that are registering artifact types they care about, and then just kind of sideloading those, or going back the other way, which is not have pull do anything related to refers, but having the plugins themselves just able to, when I say, hey, like, plugin, you wanted to verify this, you wanted to verify the content, here's the digest, and you go up to the registry and fetch it yourself, which seems to be more like what the API is designed for. And I don't know if that's more like kind of in the ORAS world of like, you're not really synchronizing stuff, you're just making requests to the registry.
Right. So the verifier architecture that you spoke about is like, we were thinking of it like a push versus pull model, which is the plugin is actually registering for a certain set of artifact types, and the client that's actually pulling would actually have to go query each one of those, right? Which is one way. Versus if you delegate it to the plugins, each plugin will have to know the authentication model and then go back as well. So I think both models have challenges, but I think what we're all agreeing on is artifact type is a good place to settle on, at least as a filter. Otherwise, you end up getting everything. And if Brandon starts attaching VHDs to images or something like that, then we'll have problems, right? People are going to attach expanded images to an image is what I'm guessing. So you don't want to pull that down.
Yeah, my specific use case is reproducibility, where I attach all the network traffic from a hermetic build. And so putting that into an image, adjacent to an image, your little 10 meg Google image or a Golang image is going to be significantly larger when you look at all the Golang modules that you had to pull down to build that.
Yeah, I think one thing that makes it complicated though from the API standpoint, like I agree about like filtering on the artifact types, and I think we'd certainly do that in Containerd the same way we filter like platforms out of an index. Like yeah, you go to pull an image, but if you only want to unpack a certain image, we're only going to pull the content that's related for the specific architecture you're in. I think the same thing could apply here. I think the tricky part with the artifact or the registry doing the artifact filtering is, so we pull in this OCI index, but it's like, it's an index that's specific for that artifact type. Like if you come back through and you want a different artifact type, now we have another index that we're trying to maintain. And ideally from like how we want to refer data and kind of collect it is, we would like to just have, we have our image, we have that image, Containerd is a tag which points to a manifest, an image manifest, and then we're going to have some link between that image manifest and the refers index, and then that refers index will have its own sub manifest, and then we can have logic for applying what we synchronize locally. The problem is like, well, now we're talking about any given image can now have multiple OCI indexes that it's using based on any particular artifact type. So
and it's mutable as well at the registry at any one point in time. They can delete artifacts, they'll no longer be referring, and they can add additional ones at a later point in time, right? So it's tricky.
Yeah, so yeah, it's definitely a tricky one, but I agree with it Sanjay was saying, and if you know how I like to implement registry interactions, I don't like the long tail of continuing to make registry requests forever. Like even the lazy loading case has complications around authentication and continuing to hold on to that authentication indefinitely. So I'm not a huge fan of that model. Yeah, but I don't know if there's a great, well, we can talk about that in the authentication working group, but
yeah, you could see the snapshot having the artifacts that were needed at that point in time, for example, right? Then the question is, how would you access them? Are you going to access them from the containers or just from the plugins?
Yeah, they should have some limited life associated with them, but I mean, for the validation plugins, it's probably not that hard because yeah, there's likely to happen at least in the scope of a poll. Like it's not like later on and it's have to go through. Well, I'm sure people would say, hey, when I run my image, that's when I want to do the validation or something, but you can treat that as a new request at that point. But yeah, it's definitely tricky having it be mutable, but I still, at least the way of implementing it now from Containerd, it's more like a sync way we're doing it. When you do a poll, you sync the content. And what Mike was saying, it's mutable, but so are tags. So like, if you do a fresh poll, you potentially get a fresh set of refers synchronized down.
I think in Containerd, we'll have to figure out how do we let the higher level parts of the stack, either plugins or the Containerd client, figure out and tell Containerd what artifacts they're interested in that are attached. Like confidential containers, you probably know fairly high up in the stack, you want to run this image in a confidential manner. So now you need to know a certain artifact type that you go and fetch to get a signature when you're pulling it. Figuring out how that gets communicated down will be a big design element, I think.
Yeah, definitely pod specs need to be augmented with artifact requirements that pass down. And then we can have plugins pick up on those and get them and process.
So, yeah, I think the initial getting it working and trying it out is probably not going to make use of the artifact filtering on the registry side to start, which is kind of why I was kind of concerned about this idea of just them growing larger and larger and larger. I mean, realistically, I don't think we're going to be dealing with cases that have like 50 different artifact types. I'm not saying that's not the case, but like first we're trying to like solve like the 80-90% of user case, which I think is pretty simple, but like we'll code against that first and then branch out to these Brandon edge cases, or sorry, the Brandon primary case, which I don't know. I don't want to call you an edge case. That sounds insulting, but like the completely non-edge normal cases that Brandon's talking about.
Someone else is going to upload a whole movie collection to an artifact. We know what's going to happen.
I mean, sure.
So with us being at time, I don't know if anything actionable has come out of this, but please keep talking about this and file stuff and issues if you think that things should be specified better or differently or stricted or loosened or whatever.
Yeah, I think there's just some of the must cases. I feel like kind of what John was saying, that maybe they shouldn't be must, or further guidance that needs to be given to the clients for these. But yeah, I agree. There's other than kind of ranting about it right now and figuring out where everybody else is kind of all I'm looking for today.
Yeah. And it is, we are still allowed to make changes to it for the time being. There will come a time where changes are not going to be as easy to make as they are now. So we should make them now while they're easy.
They're getting more and more difficult because we already have at least an implementation out there. So
yeah. But don't let that deter you.
I will not be deterred, don't worry.
Excellent. On that note, I'll see you all next week. See you folks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, folks. Bye.
Thank you.
Trans rights.